All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Errol Spence Jr. and Danny Garcia will be fighting soon. Cannot wait for that because that's the return. That's the real return of boxing for me because that is a pay-per-view fight I am looking forward to see. I would pay for regardless, pandemic or not, right? Not sure if it comes right after Gervonta and Leo Santa Cruz or not. But dude, that's a great pay-per-view over there on Fox. Is coming out. However, there is, and no, it's not however. But one of the reasons it's a great pay-per-view is because there's such a big question mark about who's going to win the fight. Now, there's somebody that out of Philadelphia named Rob Acosta, who is a coach for or strength and conditioning coach for great prospect Jaron Ennis, that is picking Danny Garcia to beat Errol Spence Jr. And he gives a very clear explanation why. Let's go through that because I think it's definitely worth consideration. Let's go through that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Errol Spence Jr., Danny Garcia, WBC mandated fight for both the IBF and the WBC titles. Danny Garcia is a former WBC champion at 147 pounds. He's also a former champion, unified champion at 140 pounds. And he was the last real kingpin of the 140-pound division before Terrence Crawford unified the division and moved up. So excellent fighter, excellent fighter. Errol Spence Jr., the IBF and the WBC champion, is now going to face Danny Garcia as a mandatory. Now, there are a lot of people that believe that Errol Spence Jr. is going to may be in a lot of trouble against Danny Garcia because of the fact that Errol Spence Jr. had a very severe car accident in, I do believe it was October of last year. So his fight with Danny Garcia, if it pops off, I think it's in September, but forgive me if it's not in September. I didn't try to memorize the dates for these pay-per-views because I know that they may move, right? All of this stuff with dates and fights right now, it could move. It can move because the COVID-19 is just doing, peaks in different places at different times. So, it's not completely certain when the date's going to be, but I truly do believe that these guys are going to get this fight. I have a feeling that they're going to really get this fight off this year. Really looking forward to it. Now, Rob Acosta, who's a strength and conditioning coach for Jaron Ennis. Now, the fact that he is a strength and conditioning coach for Jaron Ennis should let you know something, because Jaron Ennis is the top prospect in my mind in the 147-pound division, period, right? Including Virgil Ortiz, who's also very good. But I think the upside for Jaron Ennis is a good bit higher than it is for Virgil Ortiz. But Virgil Ortiz is getting a lot of the attention because Virgil Ortiz is promoted by a bigger promoter in Oscar De La Hoya. So, Virgil Ortiz is going to get DAZN promotion. He's going to get Ring Magazine promotion because that's where Oscar De La Hoya owns, right? All of that, right? But regardless, the more important thing about it is that he's from Philadelphia, right? Now, Philadelphia is the hometown of Danny Garcia. A lot of times people describe Danny Garcia as a Puerto Rican fighter, but that's one of the descriptors that you could use. But the other one is that he's a Philadelphia fighter, right? So grew up in the gyms of Philadelphia, is going to have the same mentality as Philadelphia fighters, all of that good stuff. So Rob Acosta's, training a guy out of Philadelphia. He's talking about Danny Garcia and Danny Garcia being able to beat Errol Spence Jr. Now, why does he say that he thinks Danny Garcia can beat Errol Spence Jr.? Now, he said, first of all, a little bit of a caveat. He said, it's going to take me, this is Rob Acosta talking, it's going to take me a couple rounds to see where Errol Spence Jr. is. But if I had to bet on it, if this fight was this Saturday, I would take Danny Garcia to beat him. And the reasons that he gives were specifically is the timing. He's like, because Danny Garcia punches when you punch, and he can catch you in the middle of exchanges with something very, very big. And he also said, well, the thing about Errol Spence Jr. is that Errol Spence Jr.'s defense looks a little shaky to him. and that he believes that Danny Garcia can catch him because Errol Spence Jr. gets touched. Now, my take on the matter is this. I've said it before. I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to talk about it a lot, man, because, hey, what is there better to talk about in boxing? Truthfully, there's a couple really good fights coming up this year that we know of. Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury. That thing might have got moved back to February of, I'm understanding it's got pushed back to February, but that's one. Gervonta Davis, Leo Santa Cruz is a big time fight. And I'm looking forward to seeing Leo Santa Cruz get ran through. But as far as like the high quality fights that we know pretty much are going to happen, Jermell Charlo, Jason Rosario, Errol Spence Jr., and Danny Garcia, I think are the two best, right? And again, I'm removing Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury from it because I've heard that those guys are going to go in February. Now, this is my take on it. I don't think that if Errol Spence Jr. boxes Danny Garcia, it doesn't matter whether or not he is the same Errol Spence Jr. that he was when he was fought Mikey Garcia, right? Or the Errol Spence Jr. that fought, I guess maybe the last guy that just Errol Spence just really, really ran through, somebody that is legitimate, was like the Lamont Peterson fight, right? And then the Carlos Ocampo. Carlos Ocampo's a little hard to talk about because that was a one-punch knockout at the end of the first round. Carlos Ocampo, didn't belong in the ring with him, and that was just I think it was at the IBF mandatory or whatever. But anyway, Errol Spence, even if he's not at his absolute best, I still believe can beat Danny Garcia on the back foot. Because, people talk about Errol Spence Jr. having been exposed, but Danny Garcia lost to Mauricio Herrera. In my opinion, he lost to Mauricio Herrera because Mauricio Herrera just stayed on the back foot the whole fight and just outboxed him, right? Just gave him different looks, were shifty, stayed away, didn't give, wasn't throwing like 3 and 4 punch combinations at Danny Garcia where Danny Garcia could let one go in between. Similar to, because Danny Garcia, though he's not a southpaw, is similar to Luis Ortiz in that regard, man. Because Luis Ortiz is somebody that, the more active you are, the easier it is, the more you leave yourself open for him to hit you with something, right? And so it's really important with somebody like Luis Ortiz or Danny Garcia for you to be I wouldn't say be very selective, but definitely don't get sloppy and just throw punches for the sake of throwing punches, not anticipating exactly what is gonna come back at you. So, if Errol's sitting in his chest, throwing a bunch of shots at his body, staying at mid-range the entire fight, right? And becomes predictable for Danny Garcia. Yeah, Danny Garcia can definitely hit him with one of them big hooks. And if he hits him with one of those big hooks cleanly, hey, man, anything can happen because Danny Garcia, the dude is no punk in there with that. But if Errol doesn't do that, if he stays on the outside and he just boxes and racks up points, Errol Spence Jr. is going to win that fight going away without much problem with Danny Garcia, but without much problems from Danny Garcia. It'll probably wind up looking a lot like the Keith Thurman fight, the Sean Porter fight. But, that's for people to talk about like Errol Spence Jr., like the book is out on Errol Spence Jr. And, because he showed some type of, weakness in Mikey Garcia or showed some type of weakness with Sean Porter. Like, I don't think that was weakness in either one. Now, I agree. I do believe Errol Spence Jr. and what Errol Spence Jr. says about himself. So if Errol says, hey, man, and I heard this before the actual fights, right? So this is not something I'm just saying because Errol Spence said it, that, I believe that, I just give it 100% full faith and credit. I give it 100% full faith and credit because this is something that was being said by people who were living in Texas before the Mikey Garcia fight, right? And I think it was actually first time I started hearing it was like for the Carlos Ocampo fight, was that Errol was seeming as if he was, he wasn't pushing as hard in the, in between fights as he was before, right? That he had let go of his strength and conditioning coach and he just, he wasn't as motivated on a day-to-day basis and wasn't really staying focused, was kind of letting his money get to him, all that kind of stuff. One of the one of the sayings that you hear around that is, the higher a monkey, shout out to the person that told me this, right? The higher a monkey climbs, the more he shows his ass, right? But I mean, it's reasonable. Hagler said the same thing, right? You sleeping in silk sheets. It's hard to get up and hard to get up and run in the morning when you're sleeping in silk sheets, right? So Errol Spence Jr. definitely went through that. But if he gets past that and he's in full training mechanism mode and he fights in that way, I just can't see it. And I think Danny Garcia will need a lucky punch in order to win that fight, in order to daze Errol Spence Jr. in any way. I hope that this fight winds up being a boring fight where Errol Spence Jr. just outboxes him and walks away. But, that's not Errol Spence's style. I don't think that's his mentality. He wants to bowl over. He wants to bowl over Danny Garcia. And in that desire lies the risk. And we'll see what happens, man. It's going to be a good fight. There'll be a lot of stuff coming out, back and forth about it on the lead up to the fight. And we're going to chop it up and talk about it, man, because this is boxing and this is what we have. So thank you so much for coming to the channel. If you're not subscribed, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Please feel free to join as a member. Thank you to everybody that supports in the Patreon and in the super chats and the live streams. Thank you guys so much. And with that, I'm out. Peace.